Survivor, listen carefully. When this channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll choose one lucky subscriber to win an iPhone 17 Pro Max. Subscribe now and stay in the game. The first thing you need to understand is that I wasn't looking for the silo. I was looking for my daughter. 3 days after the emergency broadcast cut to static, 3 days after the sirens in Cheyenne stopped mid-wail like someone had ripped the vocal cords from the city itself, I was driving east on a county road that didn't have a name anymore. The GPS had died with the satellites. My phone was a black rectangle of useless glass. I had a paper map from a gas station outside Laramie spread across the passenger seat, and I had a Remington 870 shotgun wedged between the console and the door with 4 shells left. That was my entire empire. My name is Daniel Coates. I'm 41 years old. I was an electrical engineer for the Wyoming Department of Transportation before the outbreak. My wife, Karen, was killed on the second day. I watched it happen through binoculars from 300 yards away because I was too slow. Because I hesitated. That hesitation is a room inside my chest I will never be able to close. My daughter, Lily, is 14. She was at a church camp near Guernsey when everything collapsed. The camp director's last text message to the parents read, "We are sheltering. Roads blocked. Please pray." That was 57 hours ago. I was driving toward Guernsey when I saw the first cluster on the highway overpass ahead. There were maybe 20 of them. They weren't shambling. I need to correct that image right now, because the movies lied to all of us. They were standing still, grouped together like commuters waiting for a bus that would never come. Heads slightly tilted, bodies swaying in micro movements that made them look like wheat stalks in a breeze. But the moment my truck engine noise carried across the empty plains, their heads snapped in unison. 20 skulls rotating toward the sound like radar dishes locking on signal. I killed the engine immediately, coasted the truck to the shoulder, and ducked below the dashboard. My heart was slamming so hard I could feel my pulse in my teeth. Through the gap between the steering wheel and the dash, I watched them. They didn't charge. They listened. For 40 seconds, they stood motionless on that overpass, scanning. Then, one by one, they began walking south along the highway, away from me, following phantom sound. I waited another 10 minutes before I started the engine again. That was when I met Harlan. He came out of the drainage ditch like a groundhog, caked head to toe in dried mud, carrying a hunting rifle and dragging a military surplus duffel bag behind him. He was maybe 60, with a white beard stained brown with dirt and eyes that looked like they'd already attended their own funeral. "You got gas," he said. No greeting, no introduction. "Half a tank." "That'll get us to the silo." I didn't know what he was talking about. He climbed into the truck bed without asking, slapped the roof panel twice, and pointed east-northeast. I should have driven away. I should have left him standing in the ditch. But loneliness in the apocalypse is its own kind of infection. And I hadn't heard another human voice in almost 2 days. "What silo?" I said through the rear window. "Atlas E, decommissioned in 65. My brother bought the land at auction in 92. 200 feet underground, reinforced concrete, blast doors rated for a 20-megaton warhead. You want to survive, Mr. Half-a-Tank? That's where you survive." Harlan didn't talk much after that. He sat in the truck bed with his rifle across his knees, watching the horizon behind us like a man who knew exactly what was following, and had made his calculations about how long until it arrived. I should have been driving toward Guernsey, toward Lily. Every mile east-northeast was a mile away from my daughter. But the cluster on the overpass had rewritten my arithmetic. I couldn't reach her dead. I couldn't reach her with 4 shells and half a tank of gas and no plan. I needed shelter. I needed to think. The sky was turning the color of a bruise when Harlan pointed at a dirt road I would have driven past without a second glance. "Turn here," he said. "Welcome to the end of the world." The surface entrance looked like nothing. "That was intentional," Harlan explained, as we stood in front of a concrete slab angled into a low hillside, overgrown with prairie grass and surrounded by rusted chain-link fencing that had collapsed in sections like rotten teeth. A steel door, painted the same faded olive drab as every piece of Cold War infrastructure I'd ever seen, was set into the slab at a 45-degree angle. It looked like a storm cellar for a farmhouse that didn't exist anymore. "My brother poured new concrete around the access tunnel in '03, Harlan said, pulling a key ring from inside his coat. There were 11 keys on it. He selected one without hesitation. Reinforced the blast door hydraulics. Put in a backup generator. The man was convinced Y2K was going to end civilization. He was 24 years early, but he wasn't wrong about the principle. "Where's your brother now?" Harlan's hands paused on the lock. "Cheyenne," he said. That single word contained an entire obituary. The door required both of us pulling on a corroded handle after the lock disengaged. It swung outward with a sound like a ship groaning against a dock, revealing a concrete ramp descending into absolute darkness. The air that came up smelled like iron, damp stone, and something chemical I couldn't identify. Harlan produced a flashlight from his duffel bag and clicked it on. "Stay close. The ramp goes down 60 feet before the first level." We drove the truck inside. The ramp was wide enough, barely, engineered originally for missile transport vehicles. Harlan directed me forward until the truck's headlights illuminated a second door, this one massive, circular, and unmistakably military. A blast door, 8 feet in diameter, set into a wall of concrete that had to be 4 feet thick. "This is the real door," Harlan said. He approached a panel on the wall, opened it, and began working a sequence of mechanical levers. Something deep inside the wall groaned. Hydraulics wheezed. The blast door rolled sideways into a recessed pocket with a low rumble that vibrated through the floor and into my skeleton. Beyond the door was a corridor lit by emergency strip lighting, dim amber, powered by something I couldn't hear. The walls were curved, tubular, like standing inside a submarine. Conduit pipes ran along the ceiling. The floor was painted concrete, cracked in places, but solid. It stretched forward about 40 feet before branching into a T-junction. "Generators solar supplemented," Harlan said, reading my expression. "Brother ran a buried cable up to panels on the south ridge. Battery bank gives us 72 hours without sun. We won't run out of light." We sealed both doors behind us. The sound of the blast door closing was the most profound silence I have ever experienced in reverse. The outside world didn't fade away. It was amputated, surgically removed. I stood in that corridor listening to nothing, literally nothing, for the first time since the outbreak began. And my nervous system didn't know how to process the absence of threat. My hands shook for 5 minutes. Harlan pretended not to notice. The silo complex was larger than I expected. The main missile bay had been converted into a 2-story living space. Harlan's brother had welded steel platforms at different levels, creating distinct areas. A sleeping quarter with 4 military cots, a kitchen with a propane stove and sealed water barrels, a storage room stacked with canned goods organized by expiration date, and a communications alcove with a ham radio setup that looked like it belonged in a museum. Below the main bay, A vertical shaft ascended another 140 feet to a flooded sub-basement that Harlan told me to ignore entirely. "How long can we stay here?" I asked. "Food for 2 people, maybe 5 months. Water filtration system pulls from an underground aquifer. Power's sustainable if the panels aren't damaged." He paused. "But you're not staying 5 months, are you?" He'd already read me. He knew I was using his silo as a way station, not a grave. "My daughter is in Guernsey." "Then you'd better rest tonight and leave at dawn." He tossed me a can of beef stew. "Eat something. You look like a man who's been dying slowly and hasn't noticed yet." He wasn't wrong about that either. I didn't leave at dawn. At approximately 4 in the morning, something hit the outer door. Not a knock, not a scratch. A single, resonant impact, like a fist made of concrete striking steel. The sound traveled down the access ramp, through 60 feet of tunnel, and arrived in the main bay as a low, distorted boom that pulled me out of sleep the way a hand pulls a drowning man from water. Harlan was already awake. He was sitting at the communications alcove with headphones around his neck, staring at the ceiling. "How long has that been happening?" I asked. "Started about an hour ago. Intervals are inconsistent. Sometimes 2 minutes apart, sometimes 9. Another impact. This one slightly different in pitch, as though whatever was hitting the door had shifted position or changed the angle of its strike. "Can they get through?" "That outer door is 3-inch hardened steel on reinforced hinges. They'd need a battering ram or explosives. But that's not what concerns me." He pulled the headphones off completely and set them on the desk. "What concerns me is that they found us. We drove in quietly, sealed the door. There's no light leak, no sound leak, no scent pathway. So how did they know?" I didn't have an answer. Neither did he. We sat in that underground corridor listening to the dead knock on our front door with a patience that felt deliberate. And I began to understand that whatever these things were, they weren't operating on instinct alone. There was something else at work: pattern recognition, collective memory. Something our early models of infection hadn't accounted for. Harlan turned on the ham radio at daybreak. He'd been scanning frequencies since he arrived 2 days before me, pulling fragments of transmission from the collapsing grid of human communication. Most channels were dead air. Some carried automated emergency loops that had been repeating since day one. Robotic voices instructing citizens to proceed to FEMA staging areas that no longer existed. But on a narrow band, around 7.245 megahertz, Harlan had found a woman. Her name was Margot. She was broadcasting from a ranch property near Torrington, about 90 miles east. Her voice was calm, precise, and carried the cadence of someone who had worked in emergency management or military communications. She spoke in scheduled intervals, 5 minutes every 2 hours, conserving battery. "Cheyenne is gone," she said during the morning broadcast. "Laramie is overrun. I-25 is impassable north of Fort Collins. I have 12 people here, including 4 children. We have water and shelter, but limited medical supplies. If anyone is receiving this, we are at coordinates." Harlan wrote the coordinates down, even though he'd already memorized them from previous broadcasts. "Torrington's past Guernsey," I said, studying the map, "by about 40 miles. So Guernsey is between us and her." Harlan looked at me with an expression I'd come to recognize as the face of a man performing calculations he didn't want to share. "You're thinking about linking up?" "I'm thinking that 12 people with 4 children and no medical supplies are going to die if someone doesn't help them. And the route goes through where my daughter might be." Might be? That word sat between us like a stone. He was right to emphasize it. Might was a currency that had been devalued to near worthlessness in this new economy. Might implied probability, and probability implied a functioning world where statistics still obeyed laws. Nothing obeyed laws anymore. The knocking on the outer door stopped at mid-morning. The silence that replaced it was worse. At least the knocking gave us information. Silence gave us only imagination. And imagination after 3 days of apocalypse is a saboteur that works for the other side. I spent the morning inventorying what the silo had. Harlan's brother had been thorough. Beyond food and water, there were tools, medical supplies in sealed bins, clothing in vacuum-packed bags, a pair of two-way radios with rechargeable batteries, and, in a locked cabinet that Harlan opened with another of his 11 keys, firearms. A bolt-action hunting rifle, a 9mm pistol, and ammunition for both. Not an arsenal. A carefully considered survival kit built by a careful man who died anyway. "We leave tomorrow," I told Harlan. "Both of us." He didn't answer immediately. He just looked at the blast door like a man saying goodbye to a promise. Harlan agreed to come, but not for the reasons I expected. "I'm not going for your daughter," he said that evening as we ate canned peaches by the amber glow of the strip lighting. "I'm going because I listened to Margot's broadcast coordinates and cross-referenced them with the topographic map my brother kept in storage. She's at the Whitfield Ranch. I sold horses to Ray Whitfield for 20 years. If there are people there, if there are children, then I have an obligation that outweighs the value of hiding. You could stay here. This place could keep you alive for months." Alive isn't the same thing as living, Daniel. My brother understood that distinction too late. He built this place to preserve his body. He forgot to preserve his reason for using it. He set the empty can down carefully, aligned it with the edge of the table. "I'll go with you as far as Torrington. What you find in Guernsey along the way is your own reckoning." We spent the rest of that evening preparing. Harlan was methodical in a way that revealed decades of self-reliance. He packed food in precise caloric portions. He checked every weapon twice, then checked them again while explaining to me that checking twice was superstition and 3 times was discipline. He mapped our route on paper, avoiding highways and population centers, tracing a path along county roads and agricultural access lanes that wound through empty ranch land. The infected cluster around noise, but they also cluster around infrastructure, he said, drawing a circle around a small town called Hawk Springs. Anywhere humans built concentration, the infection concentrated. Gas stations, grocery stores, schools, churches. Stay away from anywhere people used to gather. What about the camp? Lily's church camp is in a developed area near Guernsey State Park. Harlan's pencil stopped moving. Then we approach from the ridge and glass it first before committing. If it's overrun, you need to accept that before we descend. I didn't respond to that. I couldn't. Acceptance was a bridge I would cross only if the river beneath it was real. And until I saw Guernsey with my own eyes, I refused to construct hypothetical rivers to drown in. We set an alarm for 4 a.m. and tried to sleep. The silo was quiet in a way that surface shelters never achieve. No wind, no creaking, no distant moaning or shuffling footsteps. Just the low hum of the ventilation system pushing filtered air through corrugated ducts and the occasional tick of cooling metal somewhere deep in the complex's skeleton. It should have been peaceful. Instead, it felt like sensory deprivation. My brain, wired for constant threat assessment over the past 72 hours, began manufacturing its own dangers. I heard phantoms scratching in walls that were 4 feet of solid concrete. I imagined the blast door flexing inward under the weight of 1,000 bodies. I pictured the flooded sub-basement below us rising silently, dark water creeping up the vertical shaft, carrying something with it. Sleep came in fragments, shallow and defensive, the kind of rest that leaves you more exhausted than wakefulness. At 3:40, 20 minutes before the alarm, Harlan shook me awake. "We have a problem," he said. He led me to the communications alcove. The ham radio was on, tuned to Margot's frequency. But instead of her scheduled broadcast, the channel was carrying something else. A sound. Rhythmic, guttural. Somewhere between breathing and growling, transmitted over an open microphone. It pulsed at irregular intervals, organic and wrong, like a heartbeat recorded from inside a diseased chest. "That started 11 minutes ago," Harlan said. "On her frequency. On her exact frequency. Could she have left the mic open? Could something have gotten inside?" "That transmission is deliberate. The squelch is engaged. Someone or something keyed that microphone intentionally." We listened together in the amber half-light. The sound continued. Rhythmic, patient. Broadcasting on a frequency that 12 survivors and 4 children had been using to signal for help. Broadcasting to anyone who was listening. Broadcasting to anyone who might come. "It could be a trap," Harlan said quietly. Neither of us wanted to say what that implied about the intelligence of the things outside. "We still go," I said. Harlan nodded slowly. "We still go." Opening the blast door the next morning felt like peeling back the lid on a coffin you weren't sure was yours. Harlan worked the hydraulic levers while I stood behind the truck with the shotgun raised, barrel aimed at the widening gap as the massive circular door rolled into its pocket. The air that rushed in from the access ramp smelled different than it had yesterday. There was a new scent layered into the iron and concrete, something organic and sweet. The olfactory signature of biological decay in an enclosed space. The ramp was empty. Whatever had been knocking on the outer door was gone. But as we drove slowly upward toward daylight, the truck's headlights caught something on the concrete walls. Marks, dozens of them. Handprints and drag patterns smeared along both walls at varying heights, some at shoulder level, some near the floor, as though multiple bodies had pressed against the surfaces and moved along them in the dark. The marks were a brownish red that didn't require forensic analysis to identify. Harlan said nothing. He sat in the passenger seat now, rifle between his knees, watching the marks scroll past in the headlights like cave paintings left by a civilization that had just ended. The outer door was still sealed. The lock was intact. Whatever had made those marks had been inside the ramp tunnel, between the 2 doors, in the space where we had driven in and parked. They had been in there with us, separated only by the blast door. My hands were rigid on the steering wheel as I worked the lock and pushed the outer door open. Daylight hit us like an interrogation lamp. The Wyoming plains stretched in every direction, vast and indifferent. The grass moving in patterns that could be wind or could be something low and crawling. I scanned the perimeter through the scope of Harlan's hunting rifle. Nothing visible within a quarter mile. The highway overpass where I'd seen the first cluster was empty now. Just concrete and guardrails and an abandoned sedan with its doors open. "Move fast," Harlan said. "Daylight hours. They're less coordinated in open sunlight. Something about the visual input overwhelms them. They prefer acoustics." We drove east on dirt roads that had never been designed for speed. The truck bounced over washboard gravel and through dry creek crossings, kicking up dust plumes that I worried would signal our position like smoke signals. Harlan kept the map on his lap and called out turns with the practiced authority of a man who'd navigated this land before paved roads existed. 40 minutes in, we encountered the first body, not infected, human. A woman, mid-30s, lying face down in the road with a backpack still strapped to her shoulders. She'd been dead less than a day based on the state of her. No visible bite wounds, no blood. She looked like she'd simply stopped, collapsed mid-stride and surrendered to exhaustion or dehydration, or the accumulative weight of terror that the body eventually refuses to carry further. Harlan told me to keep driving. I did. I hated myself for it, but I did. 15 miles from Guernsey, the terrain shifted. Ranch fencing appeared along the road, intact but purposeless now, designed to contain animals that had either fled or been consumed. Windmills stood motionless against a sky that was too blue, too serene, obscenely beautiful for a world in decomposition. We passed a farmstead with the front door ripped from its hinges and what looked like furniture piled inside the windows as a barricade that had clearly failed. "Slow down," Harlan said as we crested a low ridge. Below us, the road descended into a shallow valley where a cluster of buildings marked the outskirts of a small community. A grain elevator, a feed store, a volunteer fire station with its bay doors standing open and a single red truck still parked inside. And in the parking lot of the feed store, standing in a loose formation that was neither random nor organized, approximately 40 infected. They were facing south. All of them. Oriented in the same direction like compass needles aligned to a magnetic pole that only they could sense. "What are they looking at?" I whispered. Harlan raised his binoculars. His jaw tightened. "Guernsey," he said. "They're facing Guernsey." We abandoned the direct route. Harlan guided me north along a ranch access road that skirted the valley, adding 12 miles to our approach, but keeping us below ridgeline and out of acoustic range of the cluster. The detour cost us 90 minutes, and a quarter tank of gas we couldn't afford. Every mile on the odometer was a subtraction from a finite resource that had no replenishment. And I watched the fuel gauge with the obsessive attention of a man watching a loved one's vital signs declining. By early afternoon, we reached the ridge above Guernsey State Park from the north. The town was small, fewer than 1,200 people before the outbreak. A place defined by its reservoir and the sandstone bluffs that drew modest tourism in summer months. From the ridge, through the binoculars Harlan handed me, I could see the town center, the main road, the residential grid, and the dark blue plate of the reservoir, reflecting a sky that had no sympathy. The town was not overrun. It was empty. That distinction carried its own particular horror. An overrun town shows you the enemy. An empty town asks you to find them yourself. "Where's the church camp?" Harlan asked. "South side, near the park entrance. There's a conference center and cabin complex used for retreats." We drove the ridge road south until I could see it. The retreat complex sat on a wooded slope above the reservoir. 6 log cabins arranged in a semicircle around a larger central building with a cross mounted on its roof. The cross was still there. The cabins appeared intact. No broken windows visible from this distance, no barricade debris, no bodies, and no people. "I'm going down," I said. "Not alone. We go together, clear each building methodically. And we don't split up for any reason. You understand? The infection hides. It waits in closets and under beds and behind shower curtains. I've seen it. They go still and silent and wait for the sound of a doorknob turning." We parked the truck behind a maintenance shed at the top of the slope and descended on foot. The silence was total except for our boots on pine needles and the distant lapping of the reservoir against its banks. The air smelled like pine resin and wood smoke from a fire that had burned itself out days ago. The central building was unlocked. Inside, folding chairs were stacked against walls. A whiteboard still displayed a schedule. Morning prayer. 7 o'clock / breakfast. 7:30 / team building 9 o'clock / lake activity 1 o'clock. The schedule was for a world that had been surgically removed from the timeline. And seeing it in dry erase marker made me feel a grief so specific it was almost physical. We cleared every cabin. Bunks were made. Luggage was still stored beneath beds. In cabin 4, I found Lily's bag. Her purple duffel with the iron-on patches she'd collected from state parks. Inside, clothes, a paperback novel, her asthma inhaler in its case. The inhaler broke something in me. She needed that inhaler. She couldn't go long without it in humid conditions or under physical stress. And every scenario playing out in this new world guaranteed physical stress. They evacuated, Harlan said from the doorway. He pointed at the gravel parking area. Tire tracks, multiple vehicles. They left in an organized convoy. Going where? Only one direction makes sense from here. East along Route 26 toward Torrington, toward Margot's broadcast. The logic aligned so perfectly it felt manufactured. The camp had evacuated east toward the only active signal of human survival in the region, Margot's broadcast. The same coordinates where that guttural, rhythmic sound had replaced her voice last night. I sat on the edge of Lily's bunk holding her inhaler and let the calculus reconstruct itself. My daughter had likely heard the same broadcast. Her group had likely driven toward it. And something at that location had gone wrong, or was about to. We need to move now, I said. Harlan put his hand on my shoulder. It was the first physical contact I'd experienced from another human being since Karen died. And it nearly dismantled me. We'll find her, Daniel. But we find her smart, or we don't find her at all. Route 26 told us a story that I didn't want to read but couldn't look away from. The first 10 miles out of Guernsey were littered with the evidence of flight. Abandoned vehicles lined both shoulders, some with doors open, some with windows shattered, most with engines silent and fuel tanks empty. Personal belongings scattered across the asphalt, like artifacts from a civilization mid-collapse. Suitcases, children's toys, a wheelchair folded and propped against a guardrail. Prescription medication bottles with names and dosages that represented people whose survival now depended on pills they'd never take again. Harlan navigated while I drove, weaving between the vehicular graveyard at a pace that felt suicidally slow. Every abandoned car was a potential concealment point. Every shadow beneath a truck trailer could hold something waiting. The afternoon sun was dropping toward the western horizon, and I knew from Harlan's increasingly terse directions that he was calculating daylight the way a pilot calculates fuel. "Stop," he said suddenly. Ahead, a school bus sat diagonally across both lanes, its yellow paint dulled with dust, its rear emergency door hanging open. The words, First Baptist Youth Ministry, were stenciled on the side panel in blue letters. My throat constricted. That could be from the camp. Could be. Could also be from any church in the region. Stay here. He didn't wait for agreement. Harlan moved toward the bus with his rifle raised, stepping carefully over broken glass, checking angles with a fluid competence that I hadn't seen from anyone except trained military personnel. He reached the bus and peered through the emergency door. His body language didn't change, which told me nothing and everything simultaneously. He returned 2 minutes later. Empty. But there's a map on the driver's seat with a route highlighted toward Torrington, and a note taped to the dashboard. What does it say? He handed me a folded piece of notebook paper. The handwriting was hurried but legible. It read, "If anyone finds this, we are 23 people from Guernsey Church Camp and surrounding area. We are following radio instructions to Whitfield Ranch outside Torrington. Pray for us. Director Marcus Cole, June 14th. June 14th. That was 2 days ago. Marcus Cole, I said. He's the camp director. He sent the text to the parents. Then your daughter was likely among the 23. Likely. That word again. Slightly better than might, but still insufficient to bear the weight I was placing on it. I folded the note and put it in my shirt pocket, next to Lily's inhaler, building a reliquary of evidence that my daughter was alive, each piece sacred and insufficient. We bypassed the bus and continued east. The road straightened through open ranch land, visibility extending for miles in every direction. This should have been comforting. Instead, the openness made me feel observed, as though the landscape itself had developed an awareness of movement across its surface and was reporting our position to something centralized. At mile marker 42, we found the convoy. 5 vehicles, including a church van with the same Baptist Youth Ministry logo, pulled off the road into a ranch access point. They were parked in a tight formation. All doors closed, no visible damage, no occupants. We approached on foot, weapons drawn, covering each other in an instinctive pattern that we developed without discussion. Harlan took the left flank. I took the right. We reached the church van first. Inside, empty water bottles, granola bar wrappers, blankets bunched on seats, a child's drawing of a house with green grass and a yellow sun that made me want to scream. On the dashboard, a 2-way radio identical to the ones in Harlan's silo, switched off. They stopped here voluntarily, Harlan observed. No crash, no forced halt. They chose to stop and leave the vehicles. Why would they leave the vehicles? He pointed toward the ranch access road, which wound north into rising terrain. Fresh tire tracks from at least one additional vehicle led up that road, accompanied by footprints in the soft dirt shoulder. Many footprints, adults and children. Someone met them here, Harlan said. Someone picked them up. Margot's people? That's the optimistic interpretation. What's the other interpretation? He didn't answer. He just started walking up the access road, and I followed, because forward was the only direction that contained my daughter. The access road climbed through terrain that transitioned from open grassland to low scrub hills dotted with juniper and sandstone outcroppings. The footprints in the dirt told their own narrative. Clusters of adult-sized boot prints moving in deliberate lines. Smaller shoe prints interspersed among them. And at irregular intervals, drag marks that suggested someone had been carried or had stumbled and been pulled along. The story was one of organized movement under duress, a group being led by people who knew where they were going. 2 miles up the road, we heard the generator. It was a distant mechanical hum, steady and functional, coming from beyond the next ridgeline. Harlan stopped and crouched behind a juniper stand, pulling me down beside him. "That's a commercial-grade diesel generator," he whispered. "Not a portable unit, something permanent." Whitfield Ranch. Should be within another mile. We left the road and moved along the ridgeline, staying below the crest, using the terrain for concealment. The ground was rocky and uneven, and every misplaced step sent small stones clattering downhill. Harlan moved through it like water. I moved through it like a man who designed traffic signals for a living. At the crest, we went prone and looked down into a wide valley. The Whitfield Ranch spread across the valley floor like a small compound. A main ranch house, 2-story stone and timber construction, a large metal barn, several outbuildings, a corral with post fencing. And surrounding the entire property, A perimeter wall made of vehicles, farm equipment, hay bales, and sheet metal, assembled hastily but with clear defensive intent. Inside the perimeter, people moved. I counted them through the binoculars with hands that trembled against the eyepieces. Adults carrying supplies between buildings. A woman at a cook fire near the barn. Children, 3 that I could see, sitting on the porch of the main house. And there, walking from the barn toward the house carrying a bucket, her brown hair pulled back in the ponytail she'd worn since she was 9, wearing the blue camp t-shirt with the cross on the back, was Lily. The sound I made was not a word. It was not a cry. It was something from a part of me that language has never been able to reach. A detonation of relief so profound, it temporarily collapsed my vision to a narrow tunnel with my daughter at its center. Harlan grabbed my arm before I could stand. Wait. That's her. That's Lily. I see her. Wait. His grip tightened. I looked at him and saw that his binoculars were trained not on the compound, but on the perimeter, on what was beyond it. Look at the north fence line, he said. I shifted the binoculars. Beyond the vehicle barricade on the north side, at the edge of the tree line, approximately 200 yards from the compound, shapes were standing among the junipers. Dozens of them, standing still, facing the compound. That same posture I'd seen on the highway overpass, the slight sway, the tilted heads, the absolute focused stillness of predatory patience. They're surrounding the ranch, Harlan said. East tree line too. Count them. I panned east. More figures. Then south. More still. They formed an incomplete ring around the property, maintaining distance, making no attempt to approach, simply standing and watching from the cover of the trees like spectators waiting for a performance to begin. Why aren't they attacking? I don't know. But there are at least 100 of them that I can see, and the tree cover could be hiding 3 times that number. My daughter was inside that compound, alive, carrying a bucket from a barn to a house in a world that had ended, performing chores in the shadow of a seed she might not even know was forming. The relief I'd felt 30 seconds ago curdled into something far more complex. A compound emotion made of gratitude and terror and the dawning understanding that finding her alive was not the end of this story, but the beginning of its most dangerous chapter. We have to get inside that compound, I said. Yes, Harlan agreed. And then we have to get everyone out. Neither of us said what we were both thinking. That getting out might not be something those silent watchers intended to allow. We approached the compound from the southwest, the only quadrant where the infected ring appeared to have a gap. Harlan theorized the gap was topographic, that a dry creek bed running through that sector created enough terrain disruption to break their formation pattern. I didn't care about the theory. I cared about the gap. We descended the ridge in a controlled scramble, moving from cover to cover, pausing at each position to scan for movement. The infected in the tree lines remained stationary. They didn't track our movement. They didn't react. Their attention was fixed on the compound with a singular intensity that suggested they weren't watching for opportunities, but waiting for a signal. At the perimeter, we were challenged by a voice from behind a barricade of hay bales and an overturned stock trailer. Stop right there. Hands visible. Who are you? The voice belonged to a woman. Mid-40s, hard-featured, holding a lever-action rifle with the confidence of someone who'd grown up with livestock and predators. This was Margot. I knew it before she introduced herself, because her voice carried the same precise cadence I'd heard on the radio. The cadence of someone who organized information the way other people breathed. My name is Daniel Coates. This is Harlan. We heard your broadcast. My daughter is inside your compound. Margot studied us for a long 10 seconds, then signaled to someone behind her. A gate made from a cattle panel swung open, and we were ushered inside. The compound held 27 people, 23 from the Guernsey evacuation group, plus Margot and 3 others who had been at the ranch when the outbreak hit. Of the 23, 16 were adults and 7 were children. Marcus Cole, the camp director, was among them, a tall man with a shaved head and a clerical collar he hadn't removed, standing near the cook fire like a shepherd whose flock had wandered into a minefield. None of that registered immediately. What registered was Lily running toward me from the porch, colliding into my chest with a force that nearly knocked me backward, her arms around my neck, her face buried in my shoulder, her body shaking with sobs that she'd clearly been holding in reserve for the moment. She could release them safely. I held my daughter and let the world reduce itself to the circumference of my arms, and nothing beyond that mattered for approximately 90 seconds. "I knew you'd come," she said into my shoulder. "Mom." That question, that single syllable. I'd rehearsed answers for 3 days, constructed careful explanations, built gentle frameworks of language to absorb the impact. In the moment, all of it collapsed, and I simply said, "She didn't make it, sweetheart. I'm sorry." Lily went rigid. Then she exhaled and pressed closer, and we stood there at the center of a besieged ranch compound, holding each other, while the world continued its comprehensive disintegration around us. Margot briefed us while Marcus distributed the evening meal. The situation was worse than what we'd observed from the ridge. "They arrived 4 days ago," Margot said, meaning the infected. "First, just a few, on the eastern approach. We put them down with rifles. The next day, more came. We stopped shooting because the gunfire seemed to attract reinforcements. By day 3, they'd formed the perimeter you saw. They don't approach. They don't leave. They just stand there." "They're waiting," Harlan said. "For what?" "I don't know yet." "There's more," Margot continued. She led us to the communications alcove she'd set up inside the ranch house kitchen. The ham radio was there, still tuned to 7.245 megahertz. Yesterday morning, my broadcast was interrupted. Something else transmitted on my frequency. A sound. "We heard it," I said. The transmission originated from within 2 miles of this location. I triangulated using signal strength and directional antenna positioning. Whatever made that sound is close. And it used a radio. It keyed a microphone, adjusted squelch, and transmitted a sustained signal. Those aren't reflexive actions. The room absorbed that information the way soil absorbs poison, slowly, with long-term consequences that wouldn't be fully understood until it was too late. "We need to evacuate this compound," I said. "All of us, before whatever they're waiting for arrives." Margot looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at the map on the wall. The silo was 90 miles west. The argument that erupted inside the ranch house that evening exposed every fracture line in the group's fragile cohesion. Marcus Cole wanted to stay. He believed the perimeter walls would hold, that the infected would eventually disperse. That rescue was still possible if they maintained the broadcast and waited. "God did not lead us here to abandon this place," he said with a conviction that I might have respected under different circumstances. "We have walls, we have weapons, we have water from the well. The military will come." "The military isn't coming," Harlan said flatly. "I spent 30 years ranching and 12 years listening to government communications on ham frequencies. The chain of command collapsed on day 2. Whatever's left of the federal government is consolidating around hardened installations in Colorado and Nebraska. They are not sending rescue teams to rural Wyoming. They are writing us off." Marcus turned to Margot. "You've been broadcasting for days. Surely someone official has responded. No one has responded, Marcus. We've received transmissions from 3 other survivor groups, all in worse condition than us. No military, no government, no organized response. The room divided along predictable lines. The camp group, bound by shared experience and trust in their director, leaned toward staying. Margot's original ranch occupants, who had witnessed the infected perimeter tightening over 4 days, leaned toward leaving. The children had no vote, but their presence influenced every calculation. Because any plan that involved movement through infected territory with 7 children was a plan designed by desperation. I stood in the middle, holding a topographic map and a set of facts that I laid out without rhetorical flourish. We have 2 vehicles that run, the church van and Margot's ranch truck. That's enough for 29 people if we pack tight. We have the silo 90 miles west. It's underground, it's defensible, and it has supplies. The route avoids population centers. We travel at dawn when the infected are least coordinated. We drive fast, we don't stop, and we cover 90 miles in under 3 hours. And the perimeter? Marcus asked. How do we get through 100 infected standing between us and the road? I looked at Harlan. He'd been quiet for the past several minutes, sitting in the corner with his hands folded, running calculations in the machine shop behind his eyes. The creek bed, he said finally. Southwest quadrant, the gap in their line. We drive the vehicles down the creek bed for approximately a quarter mile until it intersects the county road. The creek bed is wide enough for single vehicle passage and has steep enough banks to provide concealment. At night, Marcus pressed. At first light, engines started simultaneously. Move before they can react to the sound. We'll have maybe 90 seconds before the perimeter collapses toward the noise. 90 seconds to get 29 people into 2 vehicles and drive through a dry creek bed. 80 seconds for loading. 10 seconds for the drive to the road. I measured the creek bed this afternoon while Daniel was reuniting with his daughter. It's 300 yards to the road junction. At 20 miles per hour on uneven terrain, that's roughly 30 seconds. I was being conservative. Marcus stared at Harlan the way a man stares at someone who has just proposed jumping from a burning building. With horror, and with the growing realization that there is no better option. Margot spoke last. I've been watching the perimeter through the night scope. They've been tightening the ring by approximately 10 yards per day. 4 days ago, they were at the tree line, 200 yards out. Today, the nearest ones are at 160. At that rate, they'll be at our walls in 16 days. But I don't think they'll wait 16 days. The tightening is accelerating. Yesterday it was 15 yards. Today it was 20. She let those numbers breathe in the room. Mathematics, unlike faith, does not comfort. It merely clarifies. We leave at dawn, Margot said. Pack only essentials. Food, water, medicine, weapons. Everything else stays. Marcus bowed his head. Whether in prayer or surrender, I couldn't tell. Perhaps they were the same gesture. I spent the last night at Whitfield Ranch, sitting on the porch with Lily, watching a sky so thick with stars it looked like the universe was hemorrhaging light. Without urban power grids polluting the atmosphere, the Milky Way had returned to Wyoming with a vividness that felt like a rebuke. Here is what you forgot existed, the sky seemed to say. Here is what was always above you while you built your fragile electrical grids and your traffic signals and your careful, calibrated lives. Lily told me about the evacuation. Her voice had aged years and days, carrying inflections and pauses that belonged to someone who had been forced to metabolize experiences no 14-year-old system was designed to process. Marcus kept us calm, she said. He organized the cabins, assigned watch rotations. even kept doing morning prayers like nothing had changed. But I could see his hands shaking when he thought no one was looking. When did you first see one? The second night. One of the older kids, Tyler, he went to the bathroom building after lights out. We heard him screaming from inside the main hall. Marcus and two of the other adults ran out with flashlights. When they came back, Tyler was with them, but he couldn't stop shaking. He said there was a woman standing behind the bathroom building, just standing there, not moving, watching the door. What did Marcus do? Locked everything down. No one left the main hall until morning. When daylight came, the woman was gone. But there were footprints around every cabin, circling, like something had walked around and around each building all night. Testing. I put my arm around her and felt the sharpness of her shoulder blades through her camp t-shirt. She'd lost weight. The inhaler in my pocket pressed against my chest like an accusation. Dad, there's something I need to tell you about what happened on the road. You don't have to tell me anything tonight. I do, because it changes what you think about them, about the infected. She pulled her knees to her chest and looked out at the perimeter where distant shapes stood motionless in the moonlight, sentinels of a new order. When we were driving here in the convoy, about 20 miles out, we had to stop because a truck was blocking the road. Marcus and Ray, Margot's person, they went to move it. While they were out of the vehicles, a group of infected came out of the ditch, maybe 8 or 9. They walked right past Marcus and Ray, didn't touch them, didn't look at them. They walked straight to the van where the kids were sitting and stopped outside the windows. My blood decelerated. They stood there, looking at us through the glass. And Dad? They were organized. 3 on each side, one at the front, one at the back. Like a formation, like they'd planned it. Marcus came back and fired a warning shot, and they scattered. But the way they scattered, they didn't run randomly. They retreated to the ditch and reformed, and watched us from there. They were targeting the children. I don't think targeting is the right word. I think they were prioritizing, like assessing which vehicle contained the most, I don't know how to say it, the most value. The word value in my daughter's mouth, applied to the predatory calculus of the infected, was the single most disturbing thing I'd heard since the outbreak began. Not because it was wrong, but because a 14-year-old had arrived at a tactical analysis that most adults were still refusing to accept. These things were not mindless. They were not random. They were executing strategy. Harlan appeared at the porch door. Vehicles are loaded. Gas cans secured in the truck bed. We roll at 0500. I looked at my daughter. She looked back with eyes that had crossed a border I couldn't follow her to, and returned carrying knowledge she shouldn't have to hold. Get some sleep, I said. I don't think I remember how. I held her inhaler out. She took it without surprise, slipped it into her pocket, and went inside. The stars burned on above a world that had traded its future for a pathology it hadn't yet understood. Dawn came cold and gray, an overcast morning that pressed the sky down like a lid being lowered on a pot. Margot had organized the loading with military efficiency during the night. The church van held 16 people. The 7 children, Marcus, and 8 adults arranged around the children like a human shell. Margot's ranch truck, a heavy-duty Ford with a crew cab and long bed, held the remaining 13, including Harlan, Lily, and me, in the cab. I drove the truck. Margot drove the van. Harlan rode shotgun, with a radio handset connecting our 2 vehicles. The plan was precise. On Margot's signal, both engines start simultaneously. The van leads. The truck follows at 10-yard separation, down the creek bed, southwest, 300 yards to the county road junction. Left turn, heading west. No stops until the silo. At 4:58, Margot's voice came through the handset. Perimeter check. Southwest gap is holding. Nearest visible infected is 90 yards north of the creek bed entrance. Confirm readiness. Truck ready, Harlan responded. Van ready. Engines on my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark. Both engines fired. The sound was enormous in the pre-dawn silence. 2 combustion engines shattering the acoustic vacuum that the infected had been monitoring for days. Through the side mirror, I saw the distant shapes in the tree line shift. Heads snapping toward us. Bodies beginning to move. Not walking, running. The first time I had seen them run. And the difference between walking infected and running infected was the difference between a river and a flash flood. The van lurched forward through the gap in the barricade that had been pre-cleared during the night. I followed, keeping the truck's bumper impossibly close to the van's rear doors, gravel spraying from both sets of tires. The creek bed entrance appeared as a break in the terrain, a downward slope between eroded banks. Margot's van dipped into it nose first, suspension bottoming out, sparks flying from the undercarriage as metal scraped stone. I followed. The truck dropped into the creek bed with a jolt that sent everyone in the cab airborne for a split second. Lily grabbed the dashboard. Harlan braced against the door frame. The creek bed was wider than I expected, but rougher, strewn with river stones and dead brush that scraped the sides of both vehicles with sounds like fingernails on metal. Behind us, through the rear window, I could see the ranch perimeter receding and pouring around both sides of it like water around a stone. The infected, hundreds of them now visible, streaming out of the tree lines in a convergence that confirmed Margot's mathematics with horrific precision. They weren't just tightening the perimeter, they were collapsing it. The departure had triggered the signal they'd been waiting for. Faster, Harlan said with a calm that was itself a kind of violence. The van ahead accelerated, bouncing over rocks at a speed that threatened to shatter an axle at every impact. I matched its pace. 300 yards had never felt longer. The creek bed curved right, then straightened. And ahead I could see the county road, flat and open, a ribbon of asphalt that represented survival if we could reach it in the next 15 seconds. Margot's van hit the road junction first, tires shrieking as she turned left onto pavement and accelerated west. I followed, the truck fishtailing on the transition from gravel to asphalt, rear end swinging out before the tires caught and launched us forward. In the mirror, the creek bed behind us was filling with bodies, infected pouring down the banks into the channel we'd just vacated, a river of them flowing along the path we'd carved. But we were on pavement now, and pavement was speed. And speed was the one advantage internal combustion still held over whatever dark engine drove the infected forward. Margot's van pulled ahead at 70 miles per hour. I followed at 75. The gap between us and the creek bed widened second by second, yard by yard, and the shapes in the mirror shrank from immediate threat to diminishing silhouette to memory. Clear, Harlan said, lowering the binoculars. For now. Lily's hand found mine on the gear shift. I held it and drove west into a morning that owed us nothing. 90 miles of Wyoming highway unspooled beneath our tires in an hour and 43 minutes. Every mile was a negotiation with the landscape, a series of decisions about speed versus visibility, caution versus urgency, the seen versus the imagined. We passed through territories that ranged from eerily vacant to actively dangerous. Outside a town called Lingle, a cluster of infected gathered around a collapsed water tower in a formation that resembled a congregation. They didn't pursue us. They watched us pass with a collective focus that felt evaluative, as though cataloging our direction and speed for future reference. Margot maintained radio discipline throughout the drive. Brief transmissions, coded in a shorthand she and Harlan had developed during their pre-dawn planning. Clear ahead 2 miles. Obstruction right lane, deviation left. Speed nominal. Each transmission was a small anchor in the chaos, a proof that order could persist in a disordered world if the right voices maintained it. Lily sat between Harlan and me in the cab, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. She hadn't spoken since we left the ranch. The silence emanating from her was different from the silence of the silo, which had been an absence of external sound. Lily's silence was full. It was a silence packed with processing, the internal work of a mind reorganizing its fundamental categories of reality to accommodate what it had witnessed and what it now knew to be true about the world she would inhabit. When the dirt road turnoff to the silo appeared, I almost missed it, the same unremarkable junction I'd passed on my first approach. Harlan pointed. I turned. Margot followed. The 2 vehicles rumbled down the dirt road toward the concealed entrance, and for a disorienting moment, I experienced the landscape from the perspective of someone returning rather than arriving. The rusted fencing, the overgrown grass, the angled concrete slab, all familiar now, all containing a promise that hadn't existed during my first visit. Harlan was out of the truck before I'd fully stopped, working the lock on the outer door with practiced speed. The door swung open. The ramp descended into darkness. I drove the truck in first, then backed it out so Margot could park the van inside. Then the truck went in behind it. 29 people in 2 vehicles crammed into an underground tunnel designed for missile transport equipment. And somehow it was the safest anyone had felt in a week. The blast door opening drew gasps from the group. Most of them had never seen military infrastructure of this scale. The circular door rolling into its pocket, the corridor stretching forward under amber lighting, the curved walls that whispered of Cold War paranoia, repurposed for a threat those engineers never imagined. Children pressed against parents' legs. Adults stared with expressions that mixed wonder with the particular gratitude of people who had just been handed a future they'd stopped believing in. Margot organized the habitation with the same efficiency she'd applied to the evacuation. Sleeping arrangements by family group, food inventory and rationing schedule, water distribution protocol, sanitation rotation. She worked through it with Marcus, who had recovered his composure during the drive and now contributed organizational energy that had been paralyzed by indecision at the ranch. I watched 27 people file into a space built for nuclear Armageddon and convert it into something resembling a community. Children explored the corridors with the irrepressible curiosity that children maintain even at the end of the world. Adults claimed corners and arranged belongings and began the quiet domestic rituals that humans perform to establish territory. Folding blankets, organizing supplies, positioning personal items in patterns that say, "This space is mine. This life continues." Harlan sealed the blast door behind us. The sound of it closing, that profound amputation of the outside world, hit differently this time. The first time, it had felt like burial. This time, it felt like a perimeter forming. Not around a place, but around a population. 29 people sealed inside 200 feet of earth and reinforced concrete with food, water, power, and the one resource that no silo could manufacture: each other. Lily found a cot near the sleeping quarters and sat down. "Is this home now?" she asked. "For now," I said. "That's the only kind of home that exists anymore, isn't it?" I didn't correct her. She wasn't wrong. 3 days inside the silo established a rhythm that I hadn't thought possible. Margot and Marcus shared leadership responsibilities with a complementary dynamic that worked because neither of them wanted the role, and both of them were incapable of abandoning it. Margot handled logistics, security, and communication. Marcus handled morale, conflict mediation, and the children's emotional needs. Harlan occupied a self-appointed role as infrastructure manager, maintaining the generator, monitoring the water filtration system, and conducting structural inspections of the silo's aging bones with the attention of a man who trusted machinery more than humanity. I existed somewhere between these poles, useful in ways I hadn't expected. My electrical engineering background made me the only person who could troubleshoot the solar panel wiring when a junction box failed on day 2. I rerouted power through a secondary conduit that Harlan's brother had installed as a redundancy. And when the lights came back on in the main bay, a child named Sophie started clapping. And the sound of applause underground, genuine, spontaneous applause for a functioning light bulb, was the most moving thing I'd experienced since holding Lily at the ranch. The ham radio became our window. Margot broadcast twice daily on a new frequency, different from the one that had been compromised by the infected transmission. Responses came slowly. A family in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, 200 miles east. A former National Guard unit operating independently near Casper, 60 miles northwest. A lone voice from somewhere in the Black Hills who identified himself only as Doc and provided medical consultation over the airwaves for anyone who needed it. The network was thin, fragile, and entirely civilian. A web of survivors knitting themselves together through radio waves because every other connective tissue of civilization had been severed. On the third evening, Lily came to me with a notebook she'd found in the supply storage. She'd been writing in it. Not a diary, a record. Dates, locations, observations about infected behavior compiled from her own experience and from interviews she'd conducted with other survivors in the silo. She'd organized the information into categories: movement patterns, acoustic sensitivity, formation behavior, apparent communication, targeting priorities. "You're documenting them," I said. "Someone has to. If we're going to survive long term, we need to understand what they are, not just avoid them." I read through her notes. They were precise, clinical, and demonstrated a pattern recognition capacity that frightened me. Not because it was wrong, but because it confirmed that my daughter had adapted to this world in ways I hadn't yet managed. She was not merely surviving. She was studying, preparing, building a knowledge base that treated the apocalypse not as an ending, but as an environment requiring comprehension. "This entry here," I pointed. "You wrote that the infected prioritize enclosed spaces containing multiple heat signatures over isolated individuals in the open. What's that based on?" 3 incidents. The bathroom at camp, the van on the convoy, and the ranch, where they surrounded the compound with 27 people but ignored the cattle that had broken through the east fence and were wandering freely. They weren't hunting food, Dad. They were hunting concentration. The implications of that observation cascaded through every survival assumption we'd built. If the infected targeted concentrated human populations, then the silo, with 29 people generating heat and sound and vibration 200 feet underground, wasn't a refuge. It was a beacon. The very thing that made it safe, its capacity to hold a community, was the thing that would eventually draw them to it. I took this to Harlan and Margot that night. The 3 of us sat in the communications alcove and stared at each other across a table covered with maps and radio logs, processing the possibility that our fortress was also our lure. "We can't stay here permanently," Margot said. "We always knew that. We need to move when we're ready, not when we're forced," Harlan replied. "Then we prepare," I said. We use the time to organize, to equip, to scout routes and build a network with the other survivor groups. And when we move as something stronger than refugees. Margot looked at the map. Where? Everywhere it's quiet, nowhere they expect us to gather. It was the beginning of strategy. It was the beginning of something I hadn't felt since the first siren stopped mid-wail. It felt like resistance. I write this in the communications alcove at 0300 while the silo sleeps around me. 28 people breathing in a space built for warheads, and the air recyclers turning their exhalations into something breathable. The irony is not lost on me. I came into this as an electrical engineer with a dead wife and a missing daughter and 4 shotgun shells. I was a man defined entirely by what I'd lost. Now I'm something else. Not a leader, not a hero, nothing so clean as that. I'm a man who made one correct decision, to keep moving forward, and let that single choice compound until it accumulated into something resembling survival. Lily sleeps on a cot 12 feet from where I sit. Her notebook is under her pillow. She is already becoming something this world needs. An analyst of catastrophe, a student of the enemy. A mind that refuses to stop learning, even when the curriculum is extinction. We will leave this silo, not today, not tomorrow, but soon. We'll move as a unit through a landscape that hunts concentration, and we'll do it by becoming something the infected haven't encountered yet. Dispersed, connected, intentional. The dead are organized. It's time we were too.